So I spoke to an ancestor, but it's probably not the way you think. And that's probably because of the way you think. If you don't skip this video, I'll tell you what I mean and I'll tell you the story. So I want to tell you the story of how I spoke to my dad who died in 2011. I've been driving around for a few weeks, really thinking about a lot of the things that were going on in my life. And every time I would drive anywhere near where my father was buried, something would say, go visit his grave. And so I got to this point where maybe I was overwhelmed with everything was going, but the call was so strong that I drove to my dad's grave. And then I got out and I went over to his grave and I sat down and I began to tell him about all the things that were going on in my life. I began to tell him how I was thinking about whether I was the best dad I needed to be, whether I knew the lessons that I needed to learn, whether I was able to convey, whether I was being as gentle as I needed to be to my family. And I began to share all these things to him. And as I did that, all of a sudden these memories began to just pop into my mind. Memories of things my dad tried to teach me, memories of how he tried to teach it to me, the lessons he tried to get across to me. And in fact, as a result of that, I began to cry like a baby. And I don't cry. There's maybe, I don't know, 4 people in my life who've seen me cry more than twice, right? I don't do a lot of crying, but I began to weep like a baby. And I began to say, I get it now, Dad. I got it. All those lessons you were trying to teach me, all those things you were trying to get across to me, I got them. I know what to do. And so in that moment, I recognized that I was speaking to my dad and my dad was speaking to me. And when I tell you that story, you probably think, you didn't speak to the ancestors. And I would say, that's probably because of the way you think. You see, in your mind, speaking to the ancestors means that a spirit form of something appeared to me, or that a voice spoke to me. And that's because you've been trained to think about spirituality and yourself in a certain way. If you're from the Western world, most of how we think of ourselves is this idea that there's 3 parts of us. There's a spirit, there's a soul, and there's a body. And each of those 3 parts are separate. If your spirit is the deepest part of you, who you are eternally, the deepest part that interacts with the world in ways that we can't explain or understand, then your soul would be your mind, your will, your emotions, your thoughts, all of those things, and your body would be your physical body. And we're taught that those 3 things actually are 3 separate things. But ancient cultures knew that those 3 things are not 3 separate circles or 3 separate parts of you, but that it's more like an intertwined ball of yarn. And you can't really have a physical experience that doesn't impact your soul or that doesn't impact your spirit. And you can't have a spiritual experience that doesn't impact your soul or doesn't impact your body. And when you start interacting with your soul, your thoughts, your wills, your emotions, it's going to usually lead into the spiritual and also impact your body at the same time. And so for them, anything that happened, any experience that happened affects all 3 parts of you, and there's no way to have a separate experience. And so for me, if you think about it, when I engaged with my dad there, I actually engaged with all 3 levels of who I am. I actually drove to the space where my dad was buried, and I went and I sat there physically. I went to the place that was dedicated to my ancestor who had passed on. You might call it an altar. I sat there, and then I began to engage my soul. I began to share with my dad all the things that were going on in my life, all the struggles that I was having, my emotions, my thoughts, my will. And as a result of that, something began to interact back in my soul. Memories began to pop in, pictures, thoughts, lessons that I learned. And because they began to come in and began to remind me of what I learned and how I could teach those, it impacted me on the deepest level of who I was, which was my spirit. And I began to say, I get it. I understand. I know exactly what I'm supposed to do. And then because it hit me in the deepest part of who I was in my spirit, I began to see it manifest physically. I began to weep like a baby. My body was impacted by my spirit. You see, how we function is not as 3 separate parts, but if we function as one being where all 3 parts are connected together. And so if you recognize that speaking to the ancestors isn't just this thing that happens where a spiritual form appears, and I'm gonna say, I think that can happen too, but I don't think that it's limited to that. I think speaking to the ancestors engages all 3 parts of us, and that's what we see in the story of me and my dad. And when we began to think of our spirituality that way, If we began to think of our spirituality as hooked between our physical, our soul, and our spirit, and that the three are linked and you can't function independently of each other, we began to understand our Christianity better. That's why the people of the Bible thought of diseases as demons, right? It impacted the physical body, but they thought it was a spiritual interaction. We also think that's why it's able for the prophets to be able to look and give words of what's going to happen to people in the Old Testament. Hey, the Assyrians are going to come in and get you. They're not skipping over their logic. They got a word from God to go talk to the people. So they got the word from God in their spirit. They physically went to talk to people, and they used their soul, their thoughts, their minds, their will and emotions to tell what's going to happen. They could see the Assyrian army. They could see the Babylonian army. They knew what was coming. They didn't skip over their logic to deliver God's word. All three of those things are intertwined because that's how we function. And that's what we do at Untangled. It's a basic premise. We understand at Untangled that if we're going to deal with anything spiritually, we have to be able to deal with it at the soul and the physical level. An understanding of the self is not three separate circles, but more of an intertwined ball of yarn. And when we impact our physical, we'll impact our soul and we'll impact our spirit. If this is something you're interested in and you want to know more about, I pray that you would join us in the Untangled series. Click the link and you can go to our page where we're doing a lot of Untangle on a lot of different topics. I hope to talk to you soon.